So in this, we will discuss the topic thalamus, its major nuclei and connections of dorsal thalamus. Diencephalon is a small centrally located part of cerebrum. It is subdivided into 4 general regions, each with the term thalamus, as all are part of its name. The major component of the diencephalon are thalamus, hypothalamus. Thalamus is the gateway to the cerebral cortex, sensory. Hypothalamus regulates autonomic functions and drive related behavior. Pineal gland. Epithalamus and subthalamus are located above and below thalamus. The major constituent of epithalamus is pineal gland. It is an endocrine gland. It is located near the junction of midbrain and diencephalon. It secretes melatonin, a hormone involved in the regulation of circadian rhythms and seasonal cycles. The other major constituent of subthalamus is the subthalamus. That is, it includes subthalamic nuclei. It is a part of, or it is an important part of basal ganglia. Now coming to thalamus, the vast majority of afferents to the cerebral cortex arise in the cortex itself or the thalamus. The thalamocortical afferents include fibers representing sensory, motor, limbic pathways, with the exception of pathways of olfaction. In contrast, efferents from cerebral cortex to sites like spinal cord, brainstem, and basal ganglia reach their targets directly. This large collection of thalamocortical afferents and efferents travel through the internal capsule. Now coming to thalamus proper, there is one internal medullary lamina that subdivides the thalamus into nuclear groups, as you can see in the picture. The internal medullary lamina bifurcates anteriorly and so defines anterior nucleus in between the stems, then medial and lateral nuclear groups. The anterior and medial subdivisions have only one major nucleus each, that is anterior and medial nucleus or dorsomedial nucleus respectively. Then lateral division contains 4 major nuclei. From anterior to posterior, there are ventral anterior, then ventral lateral and ventral posterior. In the ventral posterior, again we have ventral posterior lateral and ventral posterior medial. And apart from that, there is also pulvinar. In addition, there is lateral and medial geniculate bodies. In the thalamus, so we were discussing the different nuclei. So this picture shows also one nucleus called as reticular nucleus. This is located on the lateral surface of the thalamus. Coming to types of nuclei. So one type is intralaminar. Then another type is midline. They are located between the two thalami, midline nuclei. Then there is one reticular nucleus. Neurons are located, they are called reticular nucleus, and they are located on the lateral and anterior surface of thalamus. Then there are regulatory and specific type of fibers. The major function of thalamus is it is a gateway of sensory pathway. This is accomplished by a common wiring scheme for all thalami except for the reticular nucleus. So there are two sets of inputs. One set of input is regulatory input that determine the functional state of thalamic neurons. Then there are other type that is called specific inputs that specify the kind of information a given thalamus neuron can pass to the cortex when appropriate. So these are specific. Coming to regulatory inputs, the regulatory inputs arise from reticular formation, which is in the brainstem, then thalamic reticular nucleus and the cerebral cortex. Then coming to specific inputs, thalamic nuclei receive specific inputs from subcortical structures or relay nuclei. Like medial geniculate body, for example, receives most of its specific inputs from inferior colliculus and relays this information to the auditory cortex. Then coming to another specific input, intralaminar and midline nuclei, they receive specific inputs from basal ganglia and limbic system and send back inputs or outputs to basal ganglia and limbic system. They do not send anything to cerebral cortex. Thalamic nuclei receive most of their specific inputs from cerebral cortex or association nuclei, which are an important for distributing information between different cortical areas. So they associate the two hemispheres. Then coming to regulatory inputs and attention. The regulatory inputs to thalamic neurons are able to switch them back and forth between two states. One in which these neurons are able to transmit information accurately to the cortical targets, and in another in which instead they fire periodic bursts of action potential. Thalamic neurons are in this bursting state during some phases of sleep and probably also during periods of inattention. A major mechanism of focusing attention is thought to be using regulatory inputs to switch thalamic neurons from bursting mode, that is, into accurate transmission, a tonic mode. Then we go to connections of the different thalamic nuclei and the relay nucleus. So basal ganglia and cerebellum, these are connected with ventral anterior and ventral lateral, and they connect the motor areas, that is precentral gyrus and adjacent frontal areas. Then we have medial lemniscus, spinal lemniscus. They are connected, or their nucleus is VPL, ventral posterior lateral, and they will be relaying the information to postcentral gyrus, that is somatosensory cortex. Then we go to medial lemniscus and also spinothalamic, but trigeminal components only. Earlier it was spinal component. So that is from medial lemniscus will receive from the head region. that is trigeminal components. Their nucleus is ventral posterior medial and postcentral gyrus, that is somatosensory cortex. Then we have the brachium of the inferior colliculus, and the nucleus is medial geniculate body, and they will be relating to auditory cortex. Then coming to optic tract, the nucleus is lateral geniculate, then they will be relating to visual cortex. And again there is one more, that is mammillothalamic tract. Here the nucleus, thalamic nucleus is the anterior nucleus, and the connected or relay is to cingulate gyrus. So thalamic relay from two large expanses of association cortex. The first area is prefrontal association cortex, and this is located in the anterior to the motor areas of the frontal lobe. The second one includes the parietal, occipital, temporal association cortex. Each of these fields of association cortex receives major inputs from its own thalamic association nucleus. So the associated thalamic nucleus are, for the prefrontal areas, it is dorsomedial nucleus or the medial nucleus, and for the other, that is most posterior areas, that is parietal, occipital, temporal association cortex, the nucleus is the pulvinar. Then we have reticular nucleus. It is different from all other thalamic nuclei in that, rather than being a source of thalamocortical, its neurons are a major source of regulatory inputs to the rest of the thalamus. Then we come to contents of internal capsule. Most of the afferents and efferents travel through the internal capsule, which is a bundle of fibers compacted between the lenticular nucleus on one side and the thalamus and head of caudate nucleus on the other side. The major components of the various parts of internal capsule, their origin and termination are: anterior limb will pass, that is anterior nucleus belonging to the thalamus and the cingulate gyrus. Then the dorsomedial nucleus, and it is connected to prefrontal cortex. Then we have posterior limb. It is related to motor cortex, that is spinal and brainstem, that is corticonuclear and corticospinal, and the sensory part, that is ventral, posterior, lateral and medial, so that afferent will go to postcentral gyrus. The retrolenticular part, it is associated with pulvinar nucleus, that is association cortex, and it is coming from the nucleus, that is lateral geniculate body and visual cortex. Then we have sublentiform part of the internal capsule, and it is having nucleus in the pulvinar, that is association cortex, and its nucleus is medial geniculate nucleus, and it is relating to auditory cortex. Thank you.